One choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Most people think silence means nothing until someone finally understands it. The chandelier light shimmered across polished marble floors as conversations floated softly through the air, expensive laughter mixing with the faint clink of crystal glasses. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Blackwood, a man who owned buildings taller than most people's dreams, yet somehow looked more impatient than powerful, his fingers tapping once, twice, 3 times against the edge of the table as he checked his watch. A Swiss masterpiece worth more than the average American's yearly rent. While across from him his mother sat quietly, her posture elegant but distant, her eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with a familiar kind of isolation, the kind that comes from being surrounded by voices you cannot hear. And though the restaurant staff moved with flawless efficiency, refilling wine, adjusting silverware, offering polite smiles, not one of them truly saw her. Not one of them noticed the way her hand lifted slightly as if asking for connection, only to fall back to her lap when no one responded. And Ethan noticed, of course he noticed, but noticing wasn't the same as knowing what to do. So instead he sighed softly and signaled for another server, his voice calm, but edged with frustration as he asked if anyone on staff knew sign language. And the answer came quickly, politely, and completely useless. No, sir, we don't. Followed by an apology that felt rehearsed, empty, and too late. And for a moment Ethan's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to helplessness, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to experience, because in his world problems were solved with numbers, contracts, and decisions, not silence, never silence. And then, almost unnoticed at first, someone stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that didn't ask for permission, a young waitress in a simple black uniform, her hair pulled back, her expression calm, almost unreadable, and she didn't speak, not a single word. Instead, she lowered herself slightly to meet his mother's gaze, and then gently, carefully, her hands began to move, slow at first, deliberate, each motion precise like notes in a song no one else in the room could hear. And something shifted, subtle but undeniable. His mother's eyes widened, not in confusion, but in recognition. And then, for the first time that evening, she smiled, a real smile, the kind that softened her entire face and made her look years younger. And the transformation was so immediate, so unexpected, that the air around the table seemed to pause, as if even the room itself was holding its breath. And Ethan blinked, once, twice, trying to process what he was seeing. Because this wasn't just communication, this was connection, this was something he had failed to give her for years. And the waitress continued, her hands moving with quiet confidence, her expression warm but never exaggerated, as if this wasn't something extraordinary to her, as if this was simply what you did when someone needed to be understood. And his mother responded just as fluidly, her fingers moving faster now, her face animated, alive, telling a story Ethan could not hear, but could somehow feel. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the center of the moment. He wasn't the one in control. He was just watching a stranger give his mother something he had never been able to buy. And around them the restaurant began to notice, conversations fading into whispers, heads turning subtly, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to awe. Because there was something undeniably powerful about the silence between those two women. Something that made everything else in the room feel louder, emptier, unnecessary. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his usual confidence replaced by something unfamiliar, something quieter, as his eyes stayed fixed on the waitress, on Clara, though he didn't know her name yet. Only the way she moved, the way she listened without sound, the way she made his mother feel seen. And when she finally paused, her hands coming to rest, his mother reached out gently, touching her wrist with a gratitude that needed no translation. And Clara smiled softly, nodding once as if to say you're welcome, though she never said a word. And Ethan exhaled slowly, almost unaware he'd been holding his breath. And in that moment, surrounded by wealth, power, and everything money could buy, he realized something unsettling, something he couldn't quite shake, that the most important thing happening in that room was something he had never learned how to give. The room slowly found its voice again. But Ethan did not. his gaze still fixed on Clara as she stepped back with the same quiet composure she had arrived with, as if she had not just shifted the entire atmosphere of a five-star restaurant with nothing but her hands. And for a moment he remained still, caught somewhere between disbelief and curiosity, before finally rising from his seat. The subtle movement enough to send a ripple through nearby tables who recognized him instantly, but he ignored them. His attention narrowed to one person only. "Wait," he said, not loudly, but firmly enough to stop her, and Clara turned, her expression calm, not surprised, not intimidated, just present, and that alone unsettled him more than anything else, because people usually reacted to him. They adjusted, they anticipated, they performed, but she did none of that. She simply stood there, waiting, as if his wealth carried no weight in that moment. "My mother," he began, glancing briefly at the woman, now smiling softly to herself, her fingers still resting lightly against the table as if replaying the conversation in her mind. "She does not smile like that often." And it was not a compliment, not exactly. It was something more honest, something closer to a confession, and Clara followed his gaze, her own expression softening just slightly. "She just needed someone to listen," she replied, her voice quiet, steady, and without any trace of self-importance. And Ethan hesitated, the simplicity of her answer landing heavier than expected, because in his world, solutions were complex, layered, expensive, but here it was, reduced to something almost embarrassingly basic: listening. And he nodded once, more to himself than to her, before reaching into his jacket and pulling out a sleek business card, holding it out between two fingers with practiced ease. "I want to hire you," he said, direct, efficient, the way he closed deals worth millions. "Private sessions with my mother, flexible schedule, I will pay whatever you consider fair." And for a brief second, the air seemed to tighten again, not with tension, but with anticipation, as if the room itself expected the usual outcome: acceptance, gratitude, perhaps even excitement. But Clara did not reach for the card. She did not even look at it right away. Instead, she studied him, not his suit, not his watch, but him, and there was something in her gaze that felt almost like a mirror, reflecting not who he thought he was, but who he might actually be. "You do not need to hire me," she said finally, her tone unchanged. "You just need to show up." And the words were gentle, almost kind, but they landed with a precision that caught him off guard. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not have an immediate response, because this was not a negotiation, not a problem he could solve with numbers. And Clara gave a small nod, polite but final, before turning to continue her shift, leaving the card still extended in his hand. And he slowly lowered it, watching her disappear into the rhythm of the restaurant, blending back into a role that now felt completely inadequate to describe her. And when he returned to the table, his mother looked up at him with a knowing expression, her hands moving again, slower this time, asking a question he did not understand, and he paused, just for a moment, before awkwardly attempting to mimic what he had seen earlier, his fingers uncertain, his movements clumsy, and his mother blinked in surprise before letting out a soft laugh, the sound barely audible but unmistakably warm. And though he had no idea what he had just said, he found himself smiling back, a rare, unguarded expression that felt unfamiliar on his own face. And across the room Clara noticed, just briefly, her eyes flickering toward them before returning to her work. And something shifted inside her too, subtle but real, because she had seen men like him before, powerful, distant, unreachable. But this was different. This was a beginning, not of something dramatic, not yet, but of something quieter, something that could grow if given time. And later that night, long after the restaurant had emptied and the city outside had softened into the low hum of distant traffic and streetlights glowing against the dark, Ethan sat alone in the back of his car, his driver waiting patiently for instructions. But he did not speak. Instead, he watched the short video clip he had recorded, just a few seconds, his mother smiling, Clara signing, and himself in the background, still, uncertain, and he replayed it once, then again, each time noticing something new: the ease in Clara's movements, the way his mother leaned forward, engaged, alive, and finally he exhaled, leaning back against the leather seat as a thought settled in, quiet but undeniable. that for all the power he had built, for all the control he had mastered, there was still something he did not understand, something he had never taken the time to learn, and for the first time, he was not frustrated by that realization. He was curious. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Blackwood's penthouse where the city stretched endlessly beneath him, alive, fast, predictable in its chaos. And yet inside, something felt different, something slower, as if time itself had shifted its pace without asking for permission, and Ethan stood near the glass, coffee untouched in his hand, replaying the same thought over and over again, not about a deal, not about a number, but about a pair of hands moving. In silence, precise, confident, impossible to ignore, and it unsettled him more than any boardroom confrontation ever had, because there had been no strategy behind it, no intention to impress, just truth. And truth was something he rarely encountered without conditions. And across the room his mother sat comfortably in a chair near the window, a book open on her lap though she was not reading, her attention instead on him, observing in that quiet way she always had. And when he turned, she lifted her hands, forming a simple question, slow enough for him to follow. Not perfectly, not fluently, but enough. And he hesitated before responding, his fingers awkward, uncertain, mirroring shapes he barely understood. And when he finished, she smiled again, softer this time, patient, as if encouraging a child learning to speak. And for a brief moment Ethan felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not frustration, not pressure, but something closer to humility. And he exhaled, lowering his hands as a small, almost self-conscious laugh escaped him. Because for a man who controlled billion-dollar negotiations, this felt like starting from zero. And later that morning, instead of heading directly to his office, he gave a different instruction to his driver, one that surprised even himself. And within 20 minutes the car stopped in front of a modest community center tucked between a pharmacy and a laundromat, the kind of place he would normally pass without noticing. But today, he stepped out, adjusting his jacket more out of habit than necessity. And as he entered, the air shifted immediately, warmer, softer, filled with the low hum of quiet activity, children moving between rooms, volunteers organizing materials, and on a wall near the entrance a simple sign read, "Sign Language Workshop today." And something in his chest tightened slightly, not with discomfort, but with recognition, and he followed the hallway until he heard laughter, real laughter, unfiltered. And when he reached the doorway he stopped, just outside, watching. Clara stood at the front of a small room, sleeves rolled slightly, her movements fluid as she demonstrated a series of signs to a group of about 10 people, some young, some older, all focused, all engaged, and she did not command attention, she invited it, her presence calm, steady, grounded in something far deeper than performance. And for a moment Ethan did not step in, he simply observed, taking in the way she moved, the way she corrected gently, the way she smiled when someone got it right. And then she noticed him, not immediately, but naturally, her eyes lifting toward the doorway as if sensing the shift in energy, and she paused, just briefly, before finishing her sentence with her hands and nodding to the group, signaling a short break. And as people began to move, stretching, chatting, she walked toward him, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. "You found it," she said simply, and Ethan glanced around, almost as if seeing the place for the first time through her perspective. "I was not sure what I was looking for," he admitted, and there was no pride in his voice this time, no edge, just honesty. And Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him the same way she had the night before, as if measuring something invisible. "Most people are not," she replied, and there was a hint of humor in her eyes now, subtle but unmistakable, and Ethan exhaled, a quiet breath that carried more weight than he expected. "Can you teach me?" he said, not as a command, not as an offer, but as a request. And for a second, just a second, Clara did not answer, her gaze steady, thoughtful, and then she nodded once. "Only if you are willing to be bad at it," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Blackwood smiled without calculation, without restraint, because something about that condition felt more valuable than any contract he had ever signed. The first lesson did not begin with confidence. It began with hesitation. with Ethan standing in the middle of a small room that smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers, his tailored suit suddenly feeling out of place among folding chairs and handwritten posters. And Clara stood across from him, arms relaxed, watching not like a teacher evaluating a student, but like someone waiting to see if he would stay. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to feel intentional, before she lifted her hands and signed something simple, slow, deliberate, then repeated it again, giving him time, space, patience. And Ethan blinked, trying to follow, his eyes moving from her fingers to her expression and back again, piecing together meaning like assembling something without instructions. And when he finally attempted to mirror the movement, his hands stiff, slightly off. Clara did not correct him immediately. She waited, letting him feel the shape of the mistake, and then gently adjusted his fingers, just a small shift, a subtle turn of the wrist, and suddenly the motion made more sense. And he exhaled, a quiet breath of relief mixed with something else, something unfamiliar, and she nodded once, not praising, not exaggerating, just acknowledging, and they repeated it again and again, each time a little smoother, a little more natural, until the room around them seemed to fade, the distant sounds of conversation and footsteps becoming background noise to something quieter, more focused. And then, without warning, Ethan made a sign that was completely wrong, not just incorrect, but unintentionally ridiculous, and Clara paused, her expression breaking for the first time into a soft laugh, not mocking, not sharp, just genuine. And Ethan froze, his hands still midair, before looking down at them and then back at her. "That was not right," he said, more statement than question, and Clara shook her head, still smiling. "Not even close," she replied, and for a second, just a second, there was something light between them, something almost playful, and Ethan let out a quiet laugh of his own, the sound unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And they tried again, slower this time, more deliberate, and as the lesson continued, something shifted, not in the complexity of the signs, but in him, the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his focus sharpened not on being correct, but on understanding. And Clara noticed, of course she noticed, the subtle changes that most people would miss, the way he stopped rushing, the way he started watching more carefully, and after a while she stepped back slightly, letting him attempt a full sentence on his own, a simple one, nothing complicated, and he hesitated, thinking, then moved his hands, slower than before, more intentional, and when he finished, he looked at her, not for approval, but for confirmation, and Clara's expression softened, not dramatically, just enough, and she nodded. "That one was right," she said, and something in his chest settled, a quiet sense of accomplishment that felt different from closing a deal or winning a negotiation, because this had not been about control, it had been about presence. And later, as the room began to empty and the afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Ethan remained, not out of obligation, but because he did not want to leave just yet, and Clara gathered her materials slowly, giving him space to decide. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "How long did it take you?" he asked, and she glanced at him briefly, understanding the question beneath the question. "Long enough to stop trying to be perfect," she answered, and he nodded, absorbing that, not arguing, not reframing, just letting it sit. And outside, the city continued its relentless pace, cars moving, people rushing, deals being made. But inside that small room, something much quieter was unfolding, something that could not be measured in numbers or time, something that required patience, humility, and the willingness to begin again. And as Ethan walked out later that evening, the air cooler now, the sky dimming into shades of deep blue, he did not check his phone immediately, he did not rush to the next task. Instead he lifted his hands slightly, practicing the motion they had repeated earlier, the one he had finally gotten right. And though no one around him understood what he was doing, it did not matter, because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to be understood by the world, he was trying to understand someone else. Days did not pass the same way anymore, they unfolded differently, slower in the moments that mattered and faster in everything else. And Ethan began to notice the contrast, the way his mornings still started with schedules and meetings and numbers that stretched into the millions. But now, Somewhere between those carefully planned hours, there was always a pause, a quiet space he did not rush through, and it usually led him back to the same place. The small community center where nothing about his status held any weight, and on this particular afternoon, he arrived without his driver waiting outside, without his usual urgency, just himself, stepping through the door as if it had become familiar, and Clara was already there, kneeling beside a young boy no older than 8, her hands moving gently as she guided his smaller ones through a series of signs, her expression patient, focused, completely present, and Ethan stopped for a moment, watching, not wanting to interrupt, because there was something almost sacred about the simplicity of the scene. No pressure, no expectations, just understanding being built one movement at a time. And the boy laughed when he got it wrong, not embarrassed, not discouraged, and Clara laughed with him, correcting him softly, encouraging without ever making him feel small. And Ethan felt something shift again, something deeper this time, because this was not just skill, this was care. And when Clara finally looked up and noticed him, she did not react with surprise, just a small nod, acknowledging his presence before finishing the lesson with the boy. And as the child ran off toward his parent, proud and energized, Clara stood, brushing her hands lightly against her jeans. "You are early," she said, her tone neutral but not distant, and Ethan glanced at his watch out of habit before lowering his hand. "I did not want to be late," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that felt different, less about punctuality and more about intention, and Clara noticed. Of course she noticed, the shift in tone, the absence of the usual sharp edges, and she gestured toward the chairs. "Then we can start," she said, and this time the lesson did not begin with hesitation. It began with repetition, familiar movements, practice signs. But something had changed. Ethan was not just copying anymore. He was remembering, anticipating, connecting, and when he made mistakes, which he still did, often, he did not react with frustration. He paused, adjusted, tried again, and Clara guided him without rushing, without softening the difficulty, but also without making it heavier than it needed to be. And halfway through, she stopped, not because he had failed, but because she wanted him to notice something. "You are not watching my hands," she said, and Ethan frowned slightly, confused. "Then what am I doing?" he asked, and Clara tilted her head just slightly. "You are watching my face," she replied, and the realization landed quietly, but clearly, and he exhaled, a small breath that carried understanding with it, because this was not just about movement, it was about emotion, intention, presence, and he nodded, slower this time, more aware, and when they continued, everything shifted just a little. The signs became less mechanical, more expressive, less about accuracy and more about meaning. And Clara saw it, the moment it clicked, the moment he stopped trying to perform and started trying to connect, and she allowed herself a small smile, not exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge the progress. And later, as the room emptied again and the light outside softened into early evening, they found themselves sitting across from each other, not practicing, not correcting, just resting in the quiet space that had formed between them, and Ethan leaned back slightly. His posture relaxed in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him in a boardroom. "Why did you learn this?" he asked, not out of curiosity alone, but because he wanted to understand the part of her that made all of this possible. And Clara hesitated, just briefly, her gaze shifting away for a second before returning, steady. "Because someone I loved needed me to," she said, and she did not elaborate. She did not need to, because the weight of that sentence was enough, and Ethan did not press further. He simply nodded, respecting the boundary without fully understanding it, and in that moment, something unspoken settled between them. Not a secret, not yet, but a recognition that behind the quiet confidence, behind the calm presence, there was a story he had not heard, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to uncover it immediately. He was willing to wait, and as they stood to leave, stepping out into the cooling evening air, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one, Ethan hesitated for just a second before lifting his hands, forming a simple sign, slow but clear, and Clara watched, her expression softening as she recognized it. And when he finished, she smiled, not politely, not professionally, but genuinely, because what he had just said, without a single word, was "see you tomorrow." And for the first time, it felt like more than just a routine. The next morning did not begin in a boardroom. It began in silence, the kind that no longer felt empty to Ethan, but full of something he was still learning how to understand. And as he stood in the kitchen of his penthouse, sunlight stretching across marble countertops, he practiced again, slowly, carefully, his hands moving through the shapes Clara had shown him, not perfectly, not smoothly, but with intention. And across the room his mother watched, her expression unreadable at first until her hands lifted, responding, correcting him with a small adjustment, a subtle shift that made the difference between almost right and actually understood, and he followed, concentrating in a way that had nothing to do with profit margins or timelines. And when he finally got it right, she smiled, not the surprised smile from before, but something steadier, something that felt like recognition. And that alone was enough to keep him going. And later that afternoon, the city returned him to his usual environment, glass walls, polished floors, conversations layered with urgency. But something had changed there too, because during a high-level meeting, while executives debated projections and strategies, Ethan found himself distracted, not by disinterest, but by awareness, noticing how quickly people spoke over one another, how often they pretended to listen instead of actually doing it. And for the first time, it felt inefficient in a way he could not quantify. And when someone asked for his decision, he paused, not out of uncertainty, but because he was thinking differently. And his answer came slower, clearer, stripped of unnecessary complexity. And the room adjusted, slightly confused but undeniably attentive. And when the meeting ended, one of his senior partners approached him, remarking on the shift, but Ethan only nodded, offering no explanation, because he did not have one yet, not one that could be translated into the language they understood. And as the day stretched on, he checked the time once, then again, not out of habit, but anticipation. And when the hour finally arrived, he left without delay, stepping into the evening air with a sense of purpose that felt quieter but stronger than anything he had experienced in years. And when he reached the community center, the lights were already on, warm against the darkening sky. And inside, Clara was alone this time, organizing materials, her movements unhurried. And she glanced up as he entered, a small smile forming, not surprised, not formal, just real. "You came back," she said, and Ethan nodded, setting his jacket aside without being asked. "I said I would," he replied, and there was something in that exchange, simple but meaningful, because promises, even small ones, carried weight when they were kept. And they began without ceremony, picking up where they had left off. But tonight felt different, not because the signs were harder, but because something between them had shifted, the space less formal, more familiar. And at one point, as Ethan struggled with a sequence that required both precision and fluidity, he stopped, lowering his hands with a quiet exhale. "This is harder than it looks," he admitted, and Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "It is harder when you are used to controlling everything," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only observation, but it landed clearly. And Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. "That is fair," he said, and for a moment, they stood there, the air between them lighter than before, and then Clara stepped closer, not abruptly, but naturally, reaching out to adjust his hands again, her touch brief, professional, but precise, guiding without lingering. And Ethan focused, not on the contact, but on the correction, on the meaning behind the movement. And when he tried again, slower, more deliberate, something clicked, not perfectly, but enough. And Clara nodded, approving without exaggeration, and they continued, the lesson stretching longer than usual, neither of them noticing the time until the room had grown quiet, the building nearly empty. And when they finally stopped, the silence felt different, not like the absence of sound, but like the presence of something unspoken, something that did not need to be named yet. And as they stepped outside together, the night air cool and steady, Ethan hesitated for just a second before lifting his hands again, forming a new phrase, one he had practiced earlier that morning, and Clara watched carefully, her eyes following each movement. And when he finished, there was a brief pause before her expression softened, because what he had just said, imperfect but clear, was, "I am trying." and she held his gaze for a moment longer than usual before responding in kind, her hands moving with quiet certainty. I know. And neither of them said anything after that, because they did not need to. The rhythm between them began to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the quiet spaces where routine turned into something more intentional, and days no longer felt separate, they felt connected, each one building gently on the last. And Ethan noticed it first in the smallest details, the way he no longer needed to think as hard before forming certain signs, the way his hands moved with less hesitation and more purpose. But more than that, he noticed how often his thoughts drifted back to Clara even when he was not at the community center, not in a distracting way, but in a grounding one, as if she had become a reference point for something steadier than the world he was used to. And on one particular evening, as the sky faded into a soft gray and a light rain began to fall, he arrived earlier than usual, the drops tapping quietly against the windows as he stepped inside. And Clara was not in the main room this time. And for a moment he paused, scanning the empty chairs, the stillness, before hearing a faint sound from down the hallway. Not voices, but movement, and he followed it, slower, uncertain, until he reached a partially open door, and there he saw her, sitting on the floor beside a teenage boy, his posture tense, his gaze distant, and Clara's hands moved slowly, deliberately, her expression calm, patient in a way that seemed to soften the space around them. And the boy responded hesitantly at first, his movements rough, uneven, but she did not rush him. She did not fill the silence, she let it exist, and over time, the tension in his shoulders eased, his signs became clearer, more confident, and when he finally smiled, it was small but real, and Ethan remained at the doorway, unnoticed, watching, not as an outsider, but as someone beginning to understand what he was seeing, because this was not just teaching, this was trust, built one moment at a time. And when Clara eventually looked up and saw him, she did not react with surprise, just a small acknowledgement, finishing her conversation before standing and walking toward him, closing the distance without urgency. He has not spoken to anyone in weeks, she said quietly, as if sharing something important but not dramatic, and Ethan glanced back toward the room. The boy now sitting a little straighter, a little less alone, and he nodded, absorbing the weight of what she had just done. You make it look easy, he said, and Clara shook her head slightly. It is not easy, it is just patient, she replied. And there was a difference, one he was starting to understand, and they moved back into the main room, the rain outside growing steadier, the soft sound filling the spaces between their movements as they began their lesson. But tonight felt different, not in the difficulty, but in the awareness, because Ethan was not just learning signs anymore. He was learning how to slow down, how to wait, how to allow meaning to unfold instead of forcing it. And at one point, as he struggled with a longer phrase, his frustration surfaced briefly, subtle but visible in the way his hands paused mid-motion, and Clara noticed immediately, stepping back slightly, giving him space instead of correction, and after a moment, he exhaled, resetting, trying again. Slower this time, more intentional, and when he finished, she nodded, not praising the result, but acknowledging the effort, and that mattered more than he expected. And later, as the lesson ended and the rain softened into a light drizzle, they stepped outside together, the air cool, fresh, and for a moment they stood under the awning, neither rushing to leave, the city quieter than usual, and Ethan turned slightly toward her, his hands lifting almost instinctively now, forming words he had not practiced, not perfectly, not smoothly, but honestly, and Clara watched closely, her expression shifting as she understood, because what he was trying to say was not about the lesson, not about progress, but something simpler, something more personal. And when he finished, there was a brief pause before she responded, her own hands moving with quiet certainty, and though the exchange lasted only seconds, it carried something deeper than anything they had spoken aloud. And as they finally stepped out into the night, walking side by side for a few steps before parting ways, neither of them said goodbye, because they did not need to. Something had already been said, something that would stay with them long after the rain had stopped. The next few days carried a quiet shift that neither of them named, but both of them felt, as if something had crossed an invisible line, and now everything moved with a different kind of awareness, and Ethan noticed it first in the absence of urgency. The way he no longer rushed through his schedule just to get to the end of it, but instead moved through each hour with a clearer sense of what mattered and what did not. And when evening came, he found himself standing outside the community center, before the lights had even turned on, hands in his pockets, watching the door as if waiting for something he could not fully explain. And when Clara finally arrived, a few minutes later than usual, her hair slightly damp from the lingering drizzle and her expression softer than he had seen before, she paused when she noticed him already there, a small hint of surprise flickering across her face before it settled into something warmer, something quieter. "You are early again," she said, and Ethan gave a slight nod. "I did not want to miss anything," he replied, and this time she did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, as if measuring the sincerity behind his words, before unlocking the door and stepping inside. And the evening unfolded differently, not in the structure of the lesson, but in the way they moved through it, closer now, more familiar. The pauses between corrections filled not with distance, but with understanding. And at one point, as Clara demonstrated a more complex sequence, Ethan attempted to follow without waiting for her to slow down, his hands moving faster than before, less precise but more confident. And when he finished, slightly out of sync, Clara raised an eyebrow just slightly, not disapproving, but amused. "You are skipping steps," she said, and Ethan exhaled with a faint smile. "I thought I was improving," he replied. And she shook her head gently, stepping closer, adjusting his hands. Once more, her touch light, guiding. "You are," she said, "but you still have to listen." And the word listen lingered between them, heavier now, layered with meaning beyond the lesson itself. And Ethan nodded, slower this time, more aware, and when they continued, his movements changed, less rushed, more intentional, and Clara noticed, not just the correction, but the effort behind it, the willingness to slow down even when he could move faster. And later, as the lesson came to an end and the room settled into quiet, neither of them moved to leave immediately, the space between them no longer needing to be filled with instruction or conversation. And Ethan leaned lightly against the table, his gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights flickered in the distance. "I used to think time was something you managed," he said, his voice low, thoughtful, and Clara turned slightly, listening, not interrupting. "Now it feels like something you either give or you do not," he continued, and when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation in his expression, no calculation, just clarity. And Clara held his gaze, her own expression shifting, softer now, more open than before, because she understood what he was really saying, not about time, but about presence, about choice, about what he was beginning to offer without being asked. And for a moment neither of them moved, the silence between them steady, comfortable, and then Clara lifted her hands, slowly, deliberately, forming a sentence that was not part of any lesson, not something she had planned to teach. And Ethan watched closely, his focus sharpening, reading each movement carefully, and when he understood, even partially, his expression changed, just slightly, because what she had said was simple, but it carried weight. "You are learning more than signs." And Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but softer, more reflective. And without thinking, he lifted his own hands in response, forming words that were not perfect, not polished, but real. And Clara followed, understanding before he even finished, and something shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that felt lasting, as if the space between them had closed just enough to change everything without either of them needing to say it out loud. And when they finally stepped outside, the night air calm and still, there was no rush to part ways, no need to fill the silence with unnecessary words, because what had been building between them was no longer just about learning. It was about something deeper, something quieter, something that neither of them had expected, but neither of them wanted to walk away from. Time did not announce the change. It revealed it slowly, in the way small moments began to matter more than grand gestures. And on a quiet evening a few weeks later, the restaurant where everything had begun felt different, not because it had changed, but because the people inside it had. And Ethan sat at the same table. But this time his posture was not tense, his attention not divided, his phone resting untouched beside him as he watched his mother across the table, her hands moving with growing confidence, her expressions more alive than he had seen in years. And beside her sat Clara, not in a uniform, not moving between tables, but present, invited, part of the moment rather than passing through it. And the conversation between them flowed in silence, fluid, warm, real, and Ethan followed, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to feel included, enough to understand when his mother laughed, enough to catch the rhythm of the exchange, and when he attempted to join in, his hands slower but steady, Clara glanced at him with a small, encouraging smile, not correcting, not interrupting, just allowing him the space to be part of it. And his mother reached out, touching his hand briefly, her eyes soft with something that did not need translation. And for a moment Ethan felt it fully, not as an idea, not as a realization, but as something lived, something earned. And the evening unfolded without urgency, without performance, just presence. And later, as the plates were cleared and the restaurant began to quiet, his mother excused herself gently, leaving them alone at the table. And the silence that followed was not awkward, not uncertain. It was familiar, steady, and Ethan looked at Clara, really looked this time, not as someone who had surprised him, not as someone who had taught him something, but as someone who had changed the way he moved through the world. And he exhaled slowly before lifting his hands, not rushed, not hesitant, forming each sign with care, with intention, and Clara watched closely, her attention fully on him, reading each movement, each pause. And when he finished, there was a brief stillness, a moment where the weight of what he had said settled between them, because it was not perfect, not fluent, but it was clear, unmistakably clear. And what he had said was not about lessons or progress or time. It was something simpler, something more honest, something that had been building quietly through every shared moment. Stay with me. And Clara did not respond immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she did, completely. And her gaze softened, her expression shifting into something deeper, something that carried both warmth and certainty. And when she finally lifted her hands, her movements were slow, deliberate, each sign placed with care. And Ethan watched, his focus unwavering, understanding before she even finished. And her answer was just as simple, just as honest. I already am. And neither of them smiled right away, not because there was no happiness, but because the moment was too real to rush past. And when the smiles finally came, they were quiet, unforced, lasting. And outside the city continued its rhythm, lights glowing, people moving, unaware that something small and meaningful had just taken place inside a single corner of a room. And as they stood to leave, stepping into the cool night air together, there was no need for grand promises, no need for declarations, because what they had built was not sudden, not fragile. It was steady, grounded in something deeper than words. And as they walked side by side, their hands brushing briefly before naturally finding each other, it felt simple, natural, right. And somewhere behind them, through the glass, his mother watched with a quiet smile, her hands resting gently in her lap, because she understood something that did not need to be said, that sometimes the most powerful connections are not the ones spoken aloud, but the ones learned in silence, one patient moment at a time. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit like, share it with someone who needs a reminder about kindness, and share with us where you are watching from. And subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more powerful, emotional stories like this. Every click helps us bring more meaningful stories to life.